Good afternoon, New York, and the rest of our listeners around the globe. My name is June Stoyer, and I'm the host of the Organic View Radio Show. Our podcast is available on iTunes, Zune, and you can also visit our website, which is www.theorganicview.com. If you have any questions or would like to connect with us, you can simply post a question on our wall on Facebook, send us a tweet to @theorganicview, or contact me directly at June Stoyer on Twitter. If you'd like to be on the show or would like to find out about sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at questions@theorganicview.com. Today's show is sponsored by Eden Foods, one of the most trusted names in certified organic clean foods. Listeners of the Organic View Radio Show can receive 20% off any regularly priced items, excluding cases. Simply enter the coupon code ORGVIEW when prompted during checkout. That's ORGVIEW. For more special offers, please visit our website at www.theorganicview.com. On today's show, beekeeper and bee advocate Tom Theobald and I are going to talk about the massive bee losses and devastation during the California almond pollination. We're also going to discuss issues with labeling, food security, and why people need to start putting pressure on the chemical companies. So I'd like to welcome to the show Mr. Tom Theobald. Good afternoon, Tom, and welcome back to the show.
Hello, June. It's nice to talk to you again.
Tom, it's always great to talk to you, and many of our listeners have been following your work. But for those who are just learning about the honeybee crisis, can you share with our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, I, like a lot of the hobbyists today, I started out with the objective of having one or two colonies of bees to complement a large garden, and things quickly got out of hand, and within the first year I was a commercial beekeeper. A community beekeeper on the small end of the commercial beekeeping scale. And I've done that for 38 years. So I've seen the roller coaster ride of beekeeping over almost 4 decades now.
Thank you. Now, Tom, let's talk about this last almond pollination season and what happened.
Boy, it's we're trying to get our arms around it as we speak. And what we understand at this point is that, well, first of all, let me put things in a little bit of context. The almond pollination in California is the first major pollination of the season and a major income source for commercial beekeepers. They estimate that there are about 2.5 million colonies of bees in the whole country, and the almond pollination alone requires about 1.6 million. So almost every available colony of bees is in California in February. And what happened this year is the almond pollination had just about been completed. The beekeepers had not been released from the orchards yet, and some of the almond growers began spraying the almonds, still in bloom, with fungicides and insect growth regulators, and the effect on the beekeepers who were targets was enormous. The best estimate that we can come up with is that upwards of 475,000 colonies of bees. That's about 20% of all the bees in the country. 475,000 colonies of bees were impacted, were affected, of which perhaps 80,000 were killed outright. And the likelihood is that a large percentage of the remaining colonies will die as well from the lingering effects of these two chemicals.
Could you explain to our listeners that don't quite understand how these pesticides work, why don't they have exact numbers now? Why will it take a couple of months before they have a full understanding of just how many colonies were affected?
You have to understand that there are only probably maybe 1,600 commercial beekeepers in the whole United States, of which about 1,000 are in California. That's 1,000 different beekeepers contracting with different almond growers. And you can't just pick up the telephone and do a quick survey and come up with accurate figures. And we may never have absolutely accurate figures, but we'll have a pretty good idea of what the damages have been. So I think that the 80,000, 475,000 numbers are probably as accurate as we can come up with at this point. But we may find that 200,000 or 300,000 in addition to this will die through the course of the summer. This is crippling for these beekeeping operations, and they may not be able to recover from this, certainly not in a single season.
Could you explain in a little bit more detail exactly how the pesticides affect the colonies? Is it just an outright kill, or is it something where over time it affects the brood?
It's my understanding with the fungicides, and I have never been exposed to them personally, so I'm just trying to draw my conclusions from speaking with beekeepers who are more experienced. But the fungicides can kill the bees outright immediately, what we would call an acute kill, but also have a lingering effect. Many of these chemicals have modes of action which don't reveal themselves for weeks or even months after the point of exposure. The insect growth regulators are another one that I'm not too familiar with because that has just appeared at least on my radar screen, but it's my understanding from talking with other beekeepers, experienced beekeepers, is that it will have an effect on the growth of the brood, the larval stage, the fertility of the queen, the viability of the queen, the acceptability of the queen to the colony. If a colony doesn't feel that the queen is performing properly or there's something strange about her, they will replace her. That's evolutionary. They've done this for millions of years. But if those queens have been made odd by their exposure to these chemicals and many colonies decide to replace her, what the practical effect is that colony has lost probably 3 weeks, perhaps a month, when they should be growing, because while they're raising a new queen and while that new queen is taking her maiden flight and then begins laying, 3 or 4 weeks have elapsed. And that colony is stalled on the growth curve. So by the time September or October rolls around, that colony may not be up to full strength. It may have even expired during the course of the summer because of loss of brood, because of loss of the queen, because of constant supersedure. These are some of the practical problems that the beekeepers are facing.
Thank you. Tom, last year, EPA announced label changes for the purpose of protecting bees from neonicotinoids. Can you please share with our listeners the history of the labeling process and whether or not they are, in fact, providing protection?
The labeling is very interesting, and I've been around long enough that I've been able to see the history and the evolution of labeling. The EPA was created in 1972, and among other things, one of their responsibilities was to protect pollinators against the adverse consequences of primarily the agricultural chemicals. So their responsibility was to protect pollinators. Because honeybees are managed and can be monitored, it was believed that if we focused on the honeybee and protected the honeybee, that all those other pollinators out there would be protected as well. So that was the initial philosophy, and what evolved from that was what's generally referred to as the bee caution or the bee hazard warning. And in most cases, what it says is do not apply this product or allow it to drift to blooming crops or weeds if bees are visiting the area to be treated. And that served fairly well for a number of years. And the mantra in the EPA was the label is the law. If there's any dispute, it was the label is the law. And we heard that constantly. It was pounded into us for years. Well, that served until about 1994 when a chemical called encapsulated parathion reappeared on the market and began to produce huge bee losses, sort of like what we're seeing in California today. And the beekeepers began to demand that the label be enforced. Well, now the label is the law became inconvenient for the regulators and for agribusiness, and it deteriorated to the extent that in about 1994, the state regulators through their professional organization, APCO, the American Association of Pesticide Control Officers, I believe is the full name, asked the EPA to make the label language, the bee caution, advisory. What they were asking was that a federal law be made advisory. because they found it inconvenient. Well, the EPA turned that down, but they didn't give up, and they've tried to get that through ever since. And with the new label changes, what the EPA has promoted as helping to protect the bees, in fact, accomplish just that. They neuter the bee laws.
Tom, how exactly do they neuter the bee laws?
Well, I recited the earlier bee caution, and that covered most situations with the older chemicals, but we have a new family of chemicals that have appeared in the last 10 or 15 years, systemic pesticides, neonicotinoids, which are causing huge damages all across the country, all around the globe, as a matter of fact. And the EPA was under pressure to do something, and what they have done is they have announced label changes that are specifically directed at the control of the pesticides, the neonicotinoids. What they've done, however, is they have completely ignored their responsibility to do what they say they're doing. And the first thing they've done is the neonicotinoids are used primarily as seed treatments. 242 million acres of agricultural land last year were planted to crops, the seed of which had been treated with neonicotinoids. These neonicotinoids get into the plant, they become part and parcel of the plant, they get into the soil, they have half-lives of years, tiny amounts can have profound effects. But my point is, the major delivery system is seed treatment. What these new labels do is they completely ignore that manner of delivery. They focus on foliar applications. What the EPA has done is it has completely disregarded the major delivery system of the chemicals they propose to be controlling. They, for example, encourage applications after sunset, or when the temperature is below 55 degrees. Bees fly in warm weather, and 55 degrees is about the breaking point. But that accomplishes little in the control of these pesticides when you have a pesticide that has a half-life of years, is water soluble, is going to migrate with the groundwater, is going to be drawn up by other plants, non-target plants, in toxic amounts. So EPA has completely ignored the major delivery system. But in addition to that, what they have done is they have listed a long list of exceptions, which in effect are instructions on how to avoid compliance with the law. So here we have a regulatory agency that's proposing to protect the pollinators, and they're doing so in a way that completely ignores the characteristics of the chemicals involved, which gives instructions to users on how to avoid compliance with the law. In effect, many have said that the EPA is being complicit in the commission of a crime. They are instructing users on how to avoid the very laws that they are charged with honoring and upholding. There's something seriously wrong here. It's not being addressed. EPA management has done nothing to correct these errors. Congress appears to have no interest whatsoever. Bees are dying by the millions.
Now, in regards to the situation in California, how, in your opinion, did the EPA fail to protect the honeybees?
You can look at what happened in California in two ways. Now, it's my understanding that the counties declined to investigate these bee kills because there apparently was no violation of the label. The labels on the insect growth regulators and on the fungicides say nothing about bees. So technically, the farmers were following the label and not in violation of the law. Now, that raises two questions. The first is that, as I understand the law, if something in common usage produces these kinds of damages, it is mislabeled or misbranded and should be removed from the market. So one interpretation would be that these products are mislabeled or misbranded. The EPA says, oh, we didn't know anything about this. We didn't know they were hazardous to the bees. Well, the beekeepers will tell you otherwise. They will tell you that they have been warning about the damages from these fungicides for years, and the EPA once again has simply ignored that. So misbranding or mislabeling would be one interpretation of what happened here. The other is the responsibility of the EPA is risk assessment. So the question is, did they do the adequate risk assessment? Should these chemicals ever have been released to the market without some sort of environmental hazard that protected the pollinators? So either
Well,
it's misbranding or a failure on the part of the EPA to carry out its responsibilities with regard to risk assessment.
well, Tom, isn't it true that the almond growers depend upon the commercial beekeepers for pollination so that they can produce a crop?
They do, and it's a direct dependence. My understanding of the statistics are if you're an almond grower and you have 2 colonies of bees per acre, you can expect about 2,600 pounds of almonds. I think the price right now on almonds is about $2.80 a pound. So 2,600 pounds if you have 2 colonies of bees. If you have no colonies of bees, if you have no pollination, you can expect about 60 pounds per acre. So they're directly dependent upon the bees. And you might make the argument that the farmers have been damaged here as well, because what they're doing is they're driving away, unknowingly perhaps, they're driving away something that is essential to the success of their businesses.
And Tom, what exactly does this mean as far as food security?
Boy, that's a huge question. And we've said for many, many years that the pollination by honeybees is responsible for about a third of what we eat. And that's a generally accepted figure. It's all the good stuff that the bees are responsible for. There'll be plenty of corn and rice and things like that, but the bees are responsible for a third of what we eat. So the impact on the food system could be tremendous. I've always compared the bees to the oil in an engine, and I've made that point with many of my farmer friends. I've said, you may have a $50,000 pickup sitting there idling out in front of the house, but it has about $20 worth of oil in it. Without the oil, it's not of much value. Well, the honeybee is the oil in the engine of agriculture. And when we begin to tamper with that relationship, the food security becomes a huge question.
What can consumers expect at the supermarket because of this disaster?
We're not sure what the summer is going to bring, but many of these beekeepers are going to return to summer territories that may be as toxic as what they're leaving in California. They may not be able to recover their numbers sufficiently. Some of them may not be able to recover their numbers sufficiently to stay in business. We don't know. The concern on the part of the commercial beekeepers, and they're already beginning to see the symptoms, is that there will be a lingering effect of these exposures in California that will reverberate throughout the summer with queen failures, with brood loss, with colonies that fail to thrive. They would routinely replace their numbers by splitting their strong colonies. But if you have no strong colonies, if they're all struggling, then you can't regain the numbers. So it's yet to be seen what the summer brings, but it's not looking promising.
There's been quite an interest in beekeeping from the hobbyist community. Most do not have an in-depth understanding about commercial migratory beekeeping. Can you just take a moment and explain why this disaster is not exactly something that the commercial beekeepers can easily avoid?
It appears more and more that there really is very little safe haven in this country anymore. And I mentioned it earlier that many of these commercial beekeepers will be leaving California and coming back to summer territories where they're going to be exposed to a whole range of these agricultural chemicals, not the least of which is the systemic chemicals, the neonicotinoids, which make it difficult for them to prosper even during the summer, even when they're away from California. So the entire context is unhealthy. I've said that it may not make any difference how well we beekeepers discharge our responsibilities. We can produce theoretically a healthy colony of bees, but we're sending them out into an environment that's hostile to life. They're either killed outright, The neonicotinoids interfere with their navigational ability, their memory. They fly out and don't come back. The colony dwindles. There are many, many modes of action and many, many of these chemicals that are having a negative effect, and relatively little control over that situation.
Thank you, Tom. What message would you like to leave our audience with as far as what they can do to help the bees?
We're not sure that they can help the bees, but there are certain things that they can do we think will help. One would be to plant a variety of ornamentals that are attractive to pollinators, not just the honeybees, but the native bees as well, and have a succession of bloom throughout the season. Now, when you compare a backyard to a 1,000-acre farm, the impact is relatively small. But if neighborhoods work together to promote bee habitat, it can have a fairly significant effect. And it also gives the homeowners an indication of just how many pollinators they may or may not have in their immediate realm. If they plant these flowering plants and they see no pollinators, that emphasizes the problems that we are facing. I think that the homeowners need to be cautious in what they're buying, because many of the bedding plants are grown in seed mixes that have been exposed to neonicotinoids. And the concern is that these are brought home, planted, flower, and become attractive to the pollinators, but draw up the neonicotinoids from that planting soil in amounts that are damaging to the pollinators. So you need to be careful of what your source is.
Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's always interesting to talk to you, and I greatly appreciate all the advice and especially the background about the labeling laws.
Well, thanks, June. I try to speak out whenever I can. I think these problems are very serious, and my heart goes out to these commercial beekeepers, these third and fourth generation family businesses that are struggling to survive against huge odds.
Well, all we can do is just support the beekeeping community and continue to do what we can in our own home environments.
The beekeeping community is relatively small, and we have a small voice, and to a large extent we haven't been listened to. We don't have much power. The only power we have is the power of public opinion, and we really need the public to take the time to understand what's going on here and speak out, to take action, to talk to their representatives, to demand answers, because if we don't, the future does not look good.
It certainly does not. Tom, once again, thank you for being on the show today. And folks, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been June Stoyer with the Organic Bee Radio Show. Have a great afternoon, everyone.